So welcome in, Alec. So in this video, in this podcast, I invited my friend Alec, who I met this guy on LinkedIn back in the days, and he is building an ed tech startup, which is a SaaS as well. And welcome on board, Alec.
Derek, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yes, amazing. So I've seen you building your startup, and I think I heard your story about. I read it somewhere about how you got your idea from when you were traveling in Bali. How did that come about?
Yeah, so let me take you way back to the way beginnings of OpenClass. Was before Bali even. Really, this really all started when I was a student at the University of Arizona. I was someone always who was very passionate about education, took my learning and academic journey very seriously, showed up to all my lectures, all of my classes, tried to be a good student, try to retain as much of the information as possible, but just kept feeling like, why am I leaving my classes and retaining such a relatively small percentage of the information? That is something that stuck with me throughout the rest of my time as an undergraduate student. After I graduated from the University of Arizona, moved to San Francisco, was working as a software engineer for a little bit, and started to do more research into the cognitive neuroscience of how people best retain information. Started to learn about all of these principles like spaced repetition, retrieval practice, active learning, distributed practice, all of these things that are so strongly proven to increase long-term learning outcomes, but rarely implemented in any of my classes. That's really what inspired this idea of OpenClass, to try to make it easy for instructors to incorporate these principles into their homework assignments. And as soon as I decided that I was going to pursue OpenClass full-time, as you said, that's when I decided I'm going to book a one-way ticket to Bali, build out the first version of this thing, and not come back to the States where I'm from and where it's until I had that first version ready to go. So that's where Bali came into all of this. But happy to talk all day experience in Bali.
Wait, so just to clarify, you didn't get the idea in Bali. You actually had the whole inspiration and the plan. It was back in the US, and back then, where were you based?
Yeah, so the idea for OpenClass really started when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Arizona. I would say the seed was planted my sophomore year of college, I would say. I didn't really have a specific idea of this is going to be OpenClass and this is exactly how it's going to work or anything like that back then. But my last semester of college is when I actually purchased the domain name. I created a notes app in my phone, which I actually still have, where as I was going through my classes, I just kept jotting down my problems with the current education system, how classes were being conducted, things like that, to try to inspire what would this OpenClass platform look like. I had a rough idea that I want this OpenClass the OpenClass platform to personalize and improve education, but that was just the big picture idea. I had no idea of what it would actually look like. And then I started jotting down all of these notes and was really growing this notes in this little note in my phone over the course of probably a couple years, until eventually I kind of went through all of the notes and tried to pick out what are the best ideas in here and really figure out what is this OpenClass thing going to look like. So I already had an idea of this is what I'm going to build in Bali. The idea came before Bali. Bali was all about executing and building that first version of OpenClass.
Amazing. Right. Before we wouldn't go into Bali, so I think we connected in 2022, I think, when I first started Sigma School. And recently, I've just been really just going through my Rolodex, looking out for people who are in the ed tech kind of education industry. And to be honest, I can't find many people in the education industry who's passionate about education. It's a very, very small and niche industry, in my opinion. I'm not sure if it's true for you, Alec. Is that the same kind of impression that you've gotten so far building in this industry?
It's really interesting working in education, and I do not want to throw any company, any school, any individual under the bus at all. But as you're working in education, you kind of see people whose titles are VP of Education, Chief Academic Officer, Provost, etc. People whose job description is to care about learning outcomes tend to not have that as their number one priority. Often they don't have that as their number one priority, number two priority, number three priority. And to me, it's always been a little bit disturbing that these are the people that should care about the future of education, but tend to not care as much. So that's just in higher education and K-12. In terms of other startup founders and people in this space, I'll be honest, I haven't worked super closely with like other founders of like similar learning tools, so I can't really speak on like how passionate like other companies might be.
No, exactly. So I think the whole point is there's not that many of us. Like it's just a handful of us building an ad tech, like specifically. I'm not too sure why, but dude, I'm really happy to see someone like you who has so much passion on actually focusing on the learning outcomes rather than just, you know, having someone with a VP title sitting there and making sure operations run, right? Like for me, just to share a little bit, right, at Sigma School, one thing we do with each and every one of our students is I tell my team that there's only one thing I care about. Two things I care about is, are my students happy, number one, and number two, can they get a job after the program, right? So after every single slide, every single lesson they do, we do ask them to fill up a form to give us a feedback to make sure that to understand if, you know, how well did our instructors do, to understand if our lesson did well, and finally we also have one question to understand are our coding exercises / assignments, are they good enough? And that's where OpenClass comes in, and that's where I thought of you, because I have our own framework on managing instructors and training them, and, you know, having a whole SOP and checklist to make sure instructors are doing their job, right? We also have the learning materials to make sure that our students are doing well, but we do not have yet a tool that's able to track and provide good learning materials for our students. And that's why, I considered OpenClass. But before we talk about OpenClass, I want to ask about your journey going into software, into programming. And I think you started coding when you were 12 years old or something like that. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And to just kind of comment on what you just said there,
Yep.
I think you're definitely right. Even though I don't know a lot of like the other founders of some of these other learning tools personally, just by understanding the market a little bit, it really seems like there aren't very many tools that are like super focused on like improving learning outcomes. And that's, I think, why there's this space here for OpenClass. So from that sense, I think you are right that like it is weird that like in this ed tech space, why aren't there other tools that are like really laser focused on these principles, like I said, spaced repetition, retrieval practice, active learning, all of these other things, and just really trying to optimize and improve the learning journey for students. So that's been my focus, and it's been awesome connecting with other founders like yourself that are also super concerned about the happiness and the well-being and really like the long-term outcomes for your students that you deal with. So I think that's incredible. Answering your last question about my coding journey, I guess. Yes, I did start coding when I was 12 years old in using a language that doesn't even exist anymore called Macromedia Flash, which for anyone that doesn't know about Macromedia, it was eventually acquired by Adobe, and so it became Adobe Flash. But I had been interested in computers from a super young age. When I was in elementary school, I was playing around with like MS Paint and like creating like little comics and things like that. And then when I got to middle school, started messing around with like creating like little games and things like that in Macromedia Flash. So that really started my coding journey, was just literally a hobby, just something that I found to be fun to do.
Right, amazing. So just want to ask, you did a degree in computer science, right?
Yes, correct.
Yes. So would you say that there's skills that you have today, or even the skills that you had when you were in Bali, right, to build the first MVP of OpenClass, was that skill gained since you were younger when you learned the code on your own, or was it like something that you had to learn through uni?
So I would say a combination of just like, I would say OpenClass is kind of like the culmination of like everything I've learned through my life. And like, I don't want to completely dismiss like the skills that I learned in university, but I think I learned a lot doing programming on my own, like starting, like I said, when I was 12 years old, continuing that through high school, continuing that through college, both going to like university computer science classes, as well as always trying to do personal projects on the side. I was really big into building like iPhone apps and things like that when I was like a senior in high school and then in college, and then also got into like web development a little bit. And like, for me, it was always important to have some type of side project pretty much at all times So if
Wow.
I'm learning,
So you were a builder ever since you were a kid. You wanted to build stuff and create stuff even before this whole SaaS and this whole MVP thing was a thing. You were already one of those early guys building apps.
100%, yes, yeah. So to me, like, when you're 12 years old, you're not really thinking about like, oh, like how is this thing gonna like make money, and like what's our ARR, and like what's our bottom line, and the ROI, and like all of these different terms that are super important for startups. Back when I was a kid, and like even through high school and college, a lot of these personal projects were really, what am I interested in? Like, I'm someone that always has a million ideas, and I just think it's really cool to be able to like act on those ideas and build some type of project. Not every personal project needs to be a business, but eventually when you have something that you think is really cool and important, to be able to turn it into a business, I think is also something that's very powerful.
Thanks for sharing, Alex. So we went back in the past about like to as young as you were 12 years old, and then we went to your university in University of Arizona doing computer science, and then we went on to talk a little bit about you getting a job, right? And so what gave you that decision? There has to be an event that happened that made you say, you know what, fuck it, you're gonna leave your job and get a one-way ticket to Bali, which is I think quite scary, especially at I'm guessing you were probably 22 years old back then.
Yeah, so I ended up leaving my job when I was 24, and
24.
I truly have nothing but great things to say about the company that I was working for in San Francisco. Was working with some incredible coworkers, and really felt like I learned a ton at my previous job. I was an iOS software engineer. I thought it was a really cool experience, like living in San Francisco, being able to like experience the Silicon Valley firsthand. But I just found very little meaning in my life. Like, I was working for this communication startup, and it was a really cool startup doing some really cool things. I just was not passionate about communications at all. I'm very passionate about education, and kind of as I was going in and out of work every day, I just had such a strong desire that like I need to be doing something in education and making a difference for my life to just have the meaning that I'd like for it to have. And so after saving up money for a year and a half, I finally felt like it's time to rip the Band-Aid off and just kind of pursue this thing full time.
Oh shit. What, was it not scary for you, or it was something that you planned for a year? It wasn't like there was no event that made you say, you know what, I'm just gonna do it now. Like, was there like a mindset, maybe not about the company, but something that happened in your life that got you to just do it?
So I don't think that I started this job thinking like, oh, this is just gonna be like a short time thing. Like, I'm just gonna do this for like a year and then kind of jump ship and pursue my own thing. It was really just kind of like this itch that I had internally that was like, I feel like I'm at my core just like such a builder and such an entrepreneur that it was like, I can only kind of do this for so long. Like, I feel like my purpose in life is to try to make as much of an impact in education as possible. And it just so happened that like a year and a half was kind of as long as I could kind of take it, for lack of a better term, where it was just like, okay, at this point, like I need to be pursuing this full time. Like, this is just pulling on me so hard. I have this thing here that I think is a really great idea, something that I'm so excited to pursue. I'll figure everything else out as I do it, but I just need to kind of rip that Band-Aid off, jump in 2 feet forward, and really pursue this thing full time.
I really love that energy, man. This is a very rare energy around the people from the people around me. It's really rare energy, and I think that just do it kind of moment. I think it's so important in everyone's life. Before we proceed, right?
One other quick comment too. I'll say that type of mentality and that type of approach is something that I think was the right approach for me, of just like going all in this project. But that's not to say it's the right approach for everyone necessarily. I know a lot of people in the startup world, especially people that are bootstrapping startups, would offer the advice to new entrepreneurs and people thinking about that of start your company as like a side project first. Like, make sure you still have like revenue coming in from like your full-time job, that you have a salary and you can afford to kind of like build your thing up slowly over time. And you don't have to worry about like, how am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to do X, Y, and Z? How am I going to be able to travel, take time off, etc. I totally understand that approach and that mindset. For me, I tried to do as much of OpenClass on the side before jumping to pursue it full time. I just found it like, working a 9 to 5, and especially I was living in San Francisco, working in the South Bay. It was a really long commute to and from work every day. I would get home, I would be totally drained, super exhausted. I have other things in my personal life that I want to do too. Like for me, health and fitness is super important. So like I wanted to go to the gym. I like cooking for myself. So I'm making dinner. Monday through Friday, there was zero time at all to be able to pursue OpenClass. My only opportunity was on the weekends. And it just felt like progress was way too slow for me to just pursue this only like a few hours here and there on the weekends. For me, the only way I could pursue this thing was kind of jumping into it full time. So that was the approach that worked for me.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. For Silicon Valley, right? Speaking of Silicon Valley, for a lot of us outside of the US, Silicon Valley sounds like this dreamland that a lot of us really want to visit and build your startup. And the fact that you work there, you got me curious, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think I should visit Silicon Valley as someone who builds startups and as someone who really likes this whole culture?
10.
10, really?
I think just like in terms of visiting, like it's so cool to see like all of these tech startups are here. And like, I think it is changing a little bit in terms of like, you don't need to be in the Silicon Valley anymore to start a successful business.
Yep.
You've seen it with Sigma School, like you're starting your successful business in KL. There are successful businesses all over the world outside of the Silicon Valley. So I don't think it's true anymore that like if you want to start like a world-changing company, it needs to be done in the Silicon Valley. But with that said, if you're someone in the startup world that just like loves tech and loves like the history of tech and is interested in like which companies are raising venture capital and kind of seeing like where did the magic of like Facebook and some of these other like game-changing companies start from, I think doing a little vacation, like even if you're not going to stay for a while, just going to San Francisco for a few days, exploring like Palo Alto and like the South Bay and kind of just different areas around that area, I think is just like a cool experience. So like, I think you would have an incredible time visiting San Francisco. I don't think it's a for someone that like,
if there was one thing about sorry, the speaker was breaking off, but if there was one thing about San Francisco that you would say sets it apart from everywhere else in the world, what would the one thing be based on your experience?
Based on my experience, I would say it is really cool, at least in my opinion, that it feels like almost everyone in the city is like in tech in one capacity or another. So like, it's like, I don't have the official numbers on me, but I would have to imagine it has the highest sort of percentage of software engineers in the world. Like you just go into like any coffee shop and there are a bunch of like software engineers working for Airbnb or like any of these other really cool companies starting their own companies, etc., as well as people who are in like tech sales, like a lot of account executives and like business development representatives, people like that. Just there is so much tech talent in San Francisco, as well as so many different tech companies there and all of the venture capital that's based in the Silicon Valley. To me, that's the one thing that sets it apart. Especially, I would say, if you're someone that wanted to start a big company and like raise venture capital and like hire a full tech team based in person in San Francisco or in one city in the world, to me, San Francisco is still probably the city to do that, just because it seems like there's such a high concentration of tech talent there that could help you grow your business. So yeah, that would be the one thing I would say about San Francisco.
Thanks. I think the number one reason as well is, besides ecosystem, what you're saying is you have a lot of tech talents there, that the ecosystem there is ripe. It's like this place where you have so many talents and so many companies, but the root of all of this is, I think, funding, right? Obviously, right? Like you mentioned just now before we started this recording, you mentioned I think 65% or something like that, some crazy amount of all venture funding is in Silicon Valley. So would you say that the equivalent of Silicon Valley, but without all the funding, right? So more of your bootstrapped SaaS kind of companies, would you say the Silicon Valley equivalent of that is Bali? Or no?
How so?
From my experience, because I've been to Bali twice this year, right? From my experience, I've met a lot of bootstrappers in Bali.
Derek, you just cut off there.
Oh.
The last thing I heard was you've been to Bali twice.
Yeah, I've been to Bali twice this year, and I've met so many bootstrappers in Bali, just building some weird, funky tech startup, but without funding, just one man, just grinding it out. So yeah, would you say that Bali is like the Silicon Valley, but without the funding?
That's a really interesting comparison. So first of all, I'll say I've never thought of that, but I'm really glad that you threw that comparison out there. Bali, I found to be an awesome place to start OpenClass. I think it's the perfect place for anyone that just wants to kind of like bootstrap a business and kind of like build their MVP, because what you'll find is when you go to Bali, there are so many people kind of doing the same thing, such a great like atmosphere and vibe around it, that you can go to all these different really cool co-working spaces and coffee shops, and you'll find there are so many people there that are either working remotely as, like I said, software engineers or marketing people for tech startups or salespeople for tech startups, operations people for tech startups, etc. A lot of employees for tech companies working remotely, but then also a ton of entrepreneurs just going there, kind of like what I did, just building out the first version of their product and either going to stay in Bali and continue to grow it there or take it back to Australia or Singapore or San Francisco or wherever they want to continue to grow their business. It's such an incredible place to start your business. And to me, the reasons for that are, like I said, just a lot of other people kind of doing that same type of thing. Two is just like, you're on this paradise island. Like for me, I was in kind of this location of Bali called Canggu, where you're right on the water there. Like for me, it was amazing that like, if you're just like staring at your laptop for 7 hours straight, like working on building the software, it's the best way to decompress by just like closing your laptop and going on like an hour-long beach walk or surfing for a little bit if you're into that. I struggled really bad at the surfing part of it, but you know, you've got this beautiful beach right there. You've got all of these amazing like acai bowls. The fruit is so fresh. The cost of living is super cheap, especially for people who are going there from like the US, especially in Canada and Europe and Singapore and Australia, like depending on like the market economics. Compared to Malaysia, it's probably not super cheap, but compared to like a lot of other places, you go there and you're like saving money basically by getting like a $3 breakfast there USD instead of like a $18 breakfast somewhere in the States, if that makes sense. So a lot of really great reasons, I think, for why Bali has become such a paradise for these digital nomad types. So I ended up staying in Bali for, I think, 2 months total. And the reason it was 2 months, well, so I was in Bali for 2 months, but I was in Asia for 3 months. And so kind of the reason for that was I think my visa was like 60 days on arrival. And so I kind of just like showed up to Bali, stayed for the entirety of the visa, and then like kind of had to get out. But so after Bali, I went to Singapore for a little bit. I actually went to KL for a little bit. I did a little like kind of vacation to Korea for like a week and then went back to the States with the MVP. So I wasn't exclusively in Bali. So I'm someone that like, no matter where I am, I'm going to be like as productive as possible. Definitely Korea was like much more of a vacation because I was there with some friends. When I was in Singapore and KL, I was still like there with like the intention of working. And actually, I may have mentioned this to you before, but there was a place in KL that I really liked. I believe it was called VCR. It may be irrelevant for listeners unless they're going to KL, but I found VCR to be an amazing like coffee shop in Kuala Lumpur for just working remotely, because the coffee shops in the States are very different than the coffee shops in other parts of the world. Like if you go to a coffee shop in KL, a lot of them might not be super great environments for like bringing your laptop and working for a while. VCR I found to be a really awesome place. They had great coffee there. I remember they had like great like breakfast and like pastries there, and just a really good environment for getting things done. So might be irrelevant for most listeners on this, but if anyone's going to KL, definitely recommend checking it out. Yeah, good question. So I think I was in Bali, so that was like July of 2019. So let's say July, August, September. Got back to the States probably the end of September or early October, sometime around then. And within a few weeks moved to Tucson, Arizona, which for anyone listening, that's where the University of Arizona is located, my alma mater. Literally moved back there on a whim that I'd be able to find an instructor interested in piloting OpenClass. So as soon as I got back to Tucson, I was sending a bunch of emails to every instructor that I previously had. Those instructors that I was meeting with, I would have them like refer me to other instructors, just tried to meet with as many potential users of this platform as possible. Ended up finding one instructor, his name is Gus, who was basically a TA for one of the classes that I previously took as a student, who just, I would say, expressed the most enthusiasm over OpenClass. And as I was walking him through it, just had a ton of questions and feedback. And I feel like Gus and I had kind of an immediate rapport that it was like, I really trust this guy. Like, this is the person who I want to be like the first user of this. And as anyone who's ever built a startup knows, there's always a bunch of hurdles in the way before, like, if things ever seem like they're going really well, there's something in the way that's going to kind of be like a little bit of a blocker that you need to kind of pass. So the first blocker that we really hit was Gus was like, hey, yeah, I'd like to use this, but I want to make sure that OpenClass is FERPA compliant because I don't want to get in trouble for using this. And for anyone that's not familiar with FERPA, it's basically HIPAA for education, like a lot of compliance laws for like edtech tools, specifically in the States. And so a lot of like professors are just concerned, like, hey, if I'm going to be using a tool, like I want to make sure I can't get in trouble for this. That was like a whole new kind of can of worms to try to like find an attorney and like investigate like what exactly goes into FERPA, how can we make sure OpenClass is FERPA compliant, what policies and procedures do we need, things like that. We ended up getting everything in place that we could confidently say that like, yes, OpenClass is FERPA compliant, probably like 2 weeks before Gus's class was starting. So it was definitely a huge race to the finish there to just make sure everything was set for the spring 2020 pilot, because I was really concerned, like, if we don't have this in place, the next realistic time to pilot would be that fall, which would be 8 months later. It's like, as a bootstrap startup, I don't know if we have 8 more months to just kind of like sit around and wait to potentially do this pilot. So that was the spring of 2020 that we actually did this pilot, completely free. And it was about, so let's see, that goes through about like a year after OpenClass started. It took about a year and a half to close to 2 years before we ever had our first customer actually pay us anything. So for the first like 1.5 years was just, I saved up a bunch of money from my time in San Francisco as a software engineer and literally going on like the 2 protein bar a day diet, like trying to spend as little money as possible for a year and a half to just make sure the money that I saved up would last me as long as possible. And so fortunately it did, and there weren't a ton of issues with that. Well, so it was really tough, like in the very early stages, just, you know, being a 1-person team, trying to build and grow the software. Like there are all these issues and bugs that come up, all of these feature suggestions, trying to manage all of that with trying to grow the business and trying to reach as many new instructors as possible, trying to actually like create the business and think like, how are these different instructors or schools or anyone that we're trying to work with, how can we get them to like pay us something so that this can be sustainable, so that I can continue to do this for a long time and grow the business and hire people and reach new places. And, you know, money is obviously something that can just add a ton of fuel to any type of business. So there are just so many different hurdles and kind of like stressors and things to think about and kind of work through. To be honest, the answer is everything. Like it was a ton of product development, a ton of meeting with instructors in the early stages. Like that first year, I really wasn't very concerned with like, oh, we need to get these instructors to be paying us. Like I was just concerned about getting instructors to use the platform. So I would say that first year, I spent a ton of time just doing a ton of like cold emails to individual instructors at a bunch of different universities, trying to promote this tool as best as possible. For anyone that sent cold emails before, if you send enough of them, you know that you get some angry responses back. And that was definitely new for me to deal with, and just kind of dealing with that. But slowly but surely over that first year, trying to reach new individual instructors, then we kind of had this realization as we were reaching like computer science and data science and coding based classes that, you know, we were building out a bunch of features for these types of classes. This could be a really cool type of tool for data science and software engineering and coding boot camps. And the cool thing is, once we started to approach those types of groups, it was just way easier to get them to pay something. Like anyone that's ever tried to sell into schools knows how slow and bureaucratic it can be, and like all of these budgeting issues, and like you need all of these committees to meet to get any approval on anything. It's very slow and like not super transparent about like how these budgets, what the budgets are and how they get finalized and things like that, versus like when you're dealing with like a coding boot camp or any type of like startup that you're selling into, or business or corporation. It's so much nicer to be able to hop on a call like we have been able to do, CEO to CEO, or CEO to VP of education, or CEO to VP of learning experience, or someone that's actually a decision maker that's able to tell you one way or the other, like, yes, we want to move forward with this, or no, we don't. And so through doing a lot of that outreach to the coding boot camps, it became clear that like this is definitely a niche that we can gain a lot of traction into and be able to like actually grow like the business and revenue standpoint of the business. Yeah, I would say what kept me going, honestly, like this might sound like cliche, but it's just I'm so passionate about education and just feel like I'm such an entrepreneur at heart that like I wanted to be doing this for the rest of my life. Like I love doing this so much, even though the company wasn't making money at this time. And, you know, we were reaching a very small amount of students. Like in the spring of 2020, we had one class, 57 students. That summer, we reached 3 more classes. That fall, I think we were being used by like 7 classes. So like numbers wise, it's like, you know, that first year, we probably reached a few hundred students, maybe. It's not like we were reaching thousands or tens of thousands of students. But for me, it was the coolest thing in the world to see like we're making a real positive impact for these few hundred students. Like I'm just so driven now. How can we turn that 300 into 3,000, into 30,000, into 300,000, etc. So I would say, even though you're right, like it's frustrating, like spending so much time and effort building something with no financial reward at all. It's just kind of like my internal drive and this desire to like really make a positive impact in education that really kept me going during a lot of these tough times where it could have been so easy to quit probably 5 or 6 different times, like over the course of that first year and a half. Yeah, so I don't want to dismiss venture capital entirely. Like it could be a totally viable route for a different company. I just felt for OpenClass, you know, we're a mission-driven company. Our mission is to improve and democratize education. So one of the reasons was I just felt like it was really important for me to maintain full control of the business. I didn't want to raise like a lot of money and then all of a sudden it's like I can't grow the company how I want to grow it. Our primary interest needs to be how can this company make as much money as possible, as fast as possible, and maybe not necessarily do things that are in the best interest of the future of education. So that's from a high level just overview of like why I didn't feel venture capital was right for OpenClass. I had also heard some horror stories from other founders, maybe not necessarily horror stories per se, but I was just hearing these stories and thinking like, I want no part of that, in terms of they would basically say like their full-time jobs became creating pitch decks and meeting with potential investors. And as soon as you raise one round, that kind of like buys you life for a year or a year and a half or 2 years or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden you need to either grow super quickly or start working on raising that next round. And I really didn't want to get on like this venture capital kind of treadmill. As like an online web app, it felt like we didn't necessarily need a ton of resources to grow and maintain the business, that it felt viable, that I can kind of continue to bootstrap this. our operation costs are super low, and we didn't necessarily need venture capital. So that was kind of my decision to kind of stay clear of it. But again, it worked out for OpenClass. I think that was the right approach for this business, a mission-driven company. There are other businesses that may need just way more capital to get them off the ground. Yeah, definitely. So as you said, like the early stages were all just like organic kind of emails. So I would, for example, if I was reaching out to like computer science professors, I would pull up a list of like the best computer science schools in the world, go one by one to like their computer science faculty sections, find these emails, and not saying like I was writing a unique email to every single instructor, but the process was super slow and super tedious, where I was basically just copy and pasting the instructor's email, copy and pasting like basically like a general kind of pitch to each of these instructors, and manually sending each of these emails. Super slow, super tedious, like maybe in retrospect, not a great use of my time, but like, you know, when you're bootstrapping a business, you kind of need to figure out a lot of these things on the go. So that was the early stage of this. I would say things have definitely gotten more sophisticated. I'm not sure if we have like the most sophisticated like sales and marketing and outreach approach compared to like other companies, but it's definitely gotten way better since those early stages, where we're doing a lot more like automated things, like using tools like Rocket Reach and to be able to like get emails, be able to do like drip campaigns. So like instead of manually sending each individual email, I built a script to like automate a lot of our outreach and doing automated follow-ups and making sure everyone we reach out to, we're not just sending them one email, we're sending them 3 or 4. Doing like a lot more like LinkedIn outreach too. So like trying to follow up with people in multiple different mediums. So not just email, but maybe email and LinkedIn. Starting to do some cold calls as well. So it might be an email and then a LinkedIn message and then a cold call, just making sure that we're able to reach different prospective partners or instructors. Doing a lot of search engine. Yeah, very true. One of my friends actually showed me kind of this study. I don't have the exact numbers, but the study was very clear that people are way more likely to respond to a second or third email than a first email. So to me, if you find a potential really good prospect and you're just sending them one email, you're doing yourself and your business such a disservice. Like you need to follow up with them several times to like make sure that they're seeing what you're offering. Maybe you pitch it in a few different ways. Like you're not just sending the same message back to them 3 different times, but maybe you have one that's saying like, hey, are you looking for this? Like this type of solution. Another email that shows like some metrics on like the ROI that they'd be getting from your solution. Maybe one that's like a testimonial from a customer. One of those things that's eventually going to like really catch their interest and decide to take a call with you. But so yeah, I think I totally agree with that statement. I think the follow-up is like the most important thing when doing email outreach. I actually do think it is still cold outreach. We've been trying to do some in-person events too. Just like I went to a few conferences to be able to network with people in person. I've been trying to network a little bit. I'm based in Chicago, so I've been trying to network with other startup founders in Chicago through like different meetup groups and things like that. We've been doing a lot more on search engine optimization, SEO type of things to allow people to find OpenClass more organically. We are trying to build up more like sales channels, if you will, and like strategic partnerships to be able to have more people discovering OpenClass rather than us needing to reach out to all of them. So for example, we try to strategically partner with different textbooks where the textbooks would pair their learning content with OpenClass assignments and then share those assignments with the instructors teaching out of those books. And then from a business perspective, the goal would be to try to close deals with these instructors not using the platform. It has worked out well. We haven't been able to form as many of these partnerships as I would have liked so far. We probably have like 7 or 8 textbooks that are partnered with OpenClass currently. So it's not nothing, but exactly. Yeah, it's been a great initiative for sure. Like every single semester we're guaranteed like every single one of these textbooks has a handful of instructors teaching out of them. So it's like we're always guaranteed some type of base that's going to continue to use this. But we want to be finding more of these channels to ensure like more and more use going forward. There are definitely some pros and cons with it. And look, like if we were making over $1 million in annual revenue, I would love to be able to hire a bunch of people, grow our team. It would be way much less stress on me. But, it's one of the difficulties with bootstrapping is like, it just takes way longer to grow that revenue. And until then, like a lot of the work kind of falls onto me. So I haven't done it before. It's 100% something that I would consider, just given the fact that, basic economics, like if you have to pay a software engineer in the States, that salary is going to be way higher than if you can pay a software engineer in Malaysia, for example. So from that perspective, it seems like there could be a ton of value there if you have like equal talents in different parts of the world, but the software engineer in Malaysia, you can just afford to pay less. I think a couple of the challenges would just be, one, legally, that's not my area of expertise, but I would need to like consult with our legal team to see like what it entails to hire someone not based in the US. I'm sure it's feasible. Like obviously a bunch of other companies have done it. I just personally don't know exactly what that entails. And two would be just kind of like navigating like the time difference. So as you and I have noticed, like I'm in Chicago, you're in KL, it's a 13-hour time difference. And so it could be a little bit tricky to have people like syncing up with their team if the rest of the team is based in a significantly different time zone. Yeah, so the textbook partnerships was definitely one of my like internal initiatives a few years ago, where kind of the idea was just like, hey, it's really hard to just like be reaching out to every instructor individually. That was one issue. Another issue was one of the initial like barrier to entries for new instructors was just it takes time for them to join the platform and build out all of these assignments for their classes. If they're already using textbooks anyways, it makes it so much easier that, hey, like we've got all of these OpenClass assignments ready to go, built around this textbook already. All you need to do is sign up and you can start using these assignments in your class. So I would say the combination of being able to, one, reach new instructors that, hey, they're already teaching, you've got 100 instructors teaching out of this specific textbook. If the author of that textbook or the publisher is sharing the assignments with those instructors, all of a sudden, it's no longer the OpenClass team reaching out to these individual instructors. Now they're seeing it directly from this textbook that they're using anyways. And two, the offer is so clear for these instructors that like, hey, you don't need to do anything. We've got these assignments already built out for you. All you need to do is press this button and you'll be able to clone all of these really effective assignments and reuse them for your own class. That was just like internally brainstorming like, hey, it's really difficult to reach new instructors, new customers, new partners. What are some like strategic partnership ideas that we can try? And we've definitely tried a bunch of different partnership ideas. So for example, there was a time that we were trying to reach out to like learning management systems where kind of the idea is, hey, if these learning management systems are able to reach so many instructors, and if we have a better assignment system than they have, if they could sell OpenClass with their LMS, it's a really cool idea because they can have a better offering for their LMS. They can promote like some really deep integration with OpenClass. OpenClass quizzes and review assignments and lessons either don't tend to be available, like those assignment types within most LMSs. For LMSs that do offer like basic quizzing functionality, I'm very confident that our quizzes can stack up very favorably against any LMS type of quiz. And so that was the idea, like they can improve their offering, sell it to these schools, and OpenClass would make some type of like commission or cut on each of those deals. Unfortunately, we just weren't able to find an LMS interested in pursuing that type of partnership, but we're always trying to think like what other types of strategic partnerships can we form to allow us to reach more prospective customers or partners or instructors more easily and in a bigger scale. So I'm definitely super ambitious. I want to reach as many students as I can possibly reach. So I would say, I believe so far we've reached about 40,000 students since we've started, and the company's about 5 years old. I would like to reach, I don't know, I feel like goals have like different stages to them. So like the first goal is like, let's see if we can reach 100,000 students, and then it's going to be 1 million students, and then 10 million. And like, I'm just someone who, once I hit those goals, it's not like, oh great, like I can stop now or something like that. It's always like there's a new goal that's even bigger and better. So I feel like companies just evolve over time. Like, so I definitely do have like different goals of like where I see this going. Like, what's the company going to look like once we reach 1 million in annual revenue? What's it going to look like when we reach 10 million? What's it going to look like if we can reach 100 million? So my main goal is I want to make as positive of an impact as possible in the learning journeys of as many students as possible. So I would say if I can reach 1 million students, that's, reaching 40,000 students has been incredible. If we're able to reach 100,000 students, 1 million students, 500 million students, that would be the dream and the ultimate sort of measure of success, I would say, for the company. But in terms of like how the company will evolve, I can't say exactly like, here's exactly what the company will look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I do think that there is a ton of room for this thing to evolve. Ultimately, the goal of the platform is to make learning more efficient. People are always trying to learn new things. I think there's a big application potentially in the corporate setting. I could imagine potentially selling a platform to corporations like Coca-Cola, for example, where Coca-Cola could offer like the Coca-Cola University through OpenClass, and OpenClass could provide like a bunch of like upskilling classes, just as an example. But I think there are a lot of different routes. I think OpenClass, personally, I think it could be cool to see like what an in-person school could look like. Right now, we do not have the funds to like open up like an actual in-person school and kind of like get that thing going. But I think long-term, 10 years from now, if the company is making enough money, it could be cool to see like, here's what an in-person like OpenClass campus looks like. Again, can't share like all of the details with you and exactly what that looks like, but I'm very ambitious. I'm always trying to push the envelope of like what an optimal education experience looks like. So these are just some things that come to mind that could be relevant over the next 10 years. So I would say my one tip would be make sure you're actually super passionate about what you're building, because as we talked about earlier, starting a startup, I think, is one of the most challenging things anyone can do, whether you're bootstrapping or whether you have funding behind you. It's just so difficult. There are so many problems that will inevitably come up. I don't think there's an example of any company that was just like, oh, this was smooth sailing all from day one. Like, we launched our company, a month later, we were doing 1 million in ARR. 3 months later, we were doing 10 million in ARR. Like, that's not how these things work. There are a lot of road bumps along the way. You are going to face a ton of adversity. Just be aware of that going in, that things will get really tough at certain times. And that's not to say there won't be good things too. Of course there will be. You'll close that first deal, you'll reach your first users, you'll launch that new product. And these are all things that you need to celebrate and enjoy. But at the same time, there will be some customers that you expect to move forward that end up churning, or prospective leads that end up ghosting you, or major crashes, or just any bad thing that you can think of that can happen to a business may happen to your business. And it's really important to be able to kind of fight through those and be able to problem solve very quickly, to be able to resolve these issues and just keep moving forward on that. And I think if you're super passionate about the business that you're starting, it just makes it so much easier to not quit at the first or second or third time that you face adversity. So that would be my number one advice. Like, know what you're getting into. It's going to get hard. Make sure you're super passionate about what you're doing, because that'll make it just a little bit easier to kind of stick with it and fight through any of the challenging times. So the tech stack of OpenClass, the entire tool is actually built in Python. So we use Python for our front end, Python for our back end, we're using a web app framework called Bottle, which is very similar. The more popular frameworks are like Django and Flask, but we're using a framework called Bottle just because like I'm the original software engineer of this platform. That's a library that I had used previously and was already comfortable with it before I started OpenClass. We use a tool called Heroku for kind of like all of Heroku is based on AWS, but it's kind of a tool that makes it easy to submit code and have it kind of like run on an AWS instance and scale up or down these AWS instances. We use Cloudflare, we use GitHub. So that's basically our tech stack that we work with. And I know there's a part 2 to that question, but can you remind me of the part 2? Yeah, that's an interesting question. So to be honest, that's something that just hasn't been super relevant for me. But so I would say for any builder out there, find whatever tech stack you like, stick to it, and build your platform however you'd like. That's my advice for the builders. For the aspiring like software engineers that may not have the aspirations of starting their own business, but want to work with cool startups and, you know, people doing really cool things in whatever industry, I would say it probably makes a lot more sense to find like these are the popular tech stacks and learn those tech stacks because there'll be more opportunities in the popular tech stacks. But for like most of the popular tech stacks, there's a lot of talent who knows each of them. You can probably find like generalists that are able to, even if they don't know your tech stack, to be able to learn it, etc. But so yeah, for the builders, whatever tech stack you're familiar with, for the aspiring software engineers, probably stick to like the more popular tech stacks. Although if you do have a more niche tech stack that you use, you're probably going to face less competition for those jobs. I'm such a big believer in artificial intelligence for every single industry. I think will benefit from it, as I think every single person has seen, like with these large language models, tools like ChatGPT and Llama, etc. These tools are so powerful and so cool and so rapidly evolving that it's almost impossible to see them not having such a giant impact in every single industry. I think they already have, but even for OpenClass, like we've already incorporated a lot of content generation features. I mentioned earlier that like one of the big hurdles earlier on was just kind of how do we lower that barrier to entry to make it as easy as possible for new instructors to build on our platform. And so far, content generation has solved a lot of those issues to make it super easy. An instructor can go onto the platform and enter, hey, I want an assignment in X, Y, and Z, and have OpenClass generate it for them. So that's how it's already impacted OpenClass. I think AI is going to impact education in such a significant way as well. I think there has been some resistance among administrators, among instructors, of just having kind of clunky tools in the classroom that kind of promote themselves as like, we're going to be this incredible tool that's going to save you so much time and like really do all of these amazing things for your classroom, that end up just being really complicated, and teachers end up not knowing how to use them, and they end up not really improving their classes at all. But I think long-term, teachers and administrators will start to embrace these tools, especially as the tools improve, when they're able to see, wow, this tool really does save me a ton of time. It really does improve learning outcomes for my students. I just think there's so much potential for AI in the classroom, in and outside of the classroom, to do incredible things in education. So I'm personally super excited about that. I'm hoping that OpenClass will be kind of like on the front line of this kind of AI revolution in education. But it's so clear that every single startup, it seems like, needs to be incorporating AI into their platform. Otherwise, they're going to lose out to the ones that do. I still believe so. I think coding is such an important skill, and I think it's such a good thing too, the younger that people can learn to code, because then they can learn things that kind of build on that foundational knowledge of software engineering. So for example, if you want to be a data scientist, I think having like that software engineering foundation only plays to your advantage. Similarly, like prompt engineering, all of these things, I think it only benefits people if they know how to code, and they'll be able to leverage these tools better. They'll be able to know more specifically how these types of technologies work, etc. So to answer your question, yes, I do think that learning to code is and will continue to be a super important skill for people for the foreseeable future. Derek, thanks so much for having me on here. Yeah, if you ever come to the US, please let me know. It'd be great to do San Francisco together or Chicago or something like that. I'm such a huge fan of Asia too. I studied abroad in Singapore and like spent a ton of time traveling Southeast Asia, obviously my time in Bali. So I'm hoping I'll be able to make my way back out there at some point in the not too distant future too.